Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. While senior Israeli officials keep trying to stop or at least amend the American tendency to renew the nuclear deal with Iran, Jerusalem and Washington are on the same page regarding the determination to fight Iran's aggressive moves in the Middle East. Iranian forces and proxies in Syria and elsewhere pose continuous danger to both Israel's territory and American troops, either each on its own or in various forms of cooperation. The Israel Defense Forces and U.S. Central Command have been striking Iran's affiliated targets. It was no coincidence that Defense Minister Benny Gantz visited CENTCOM's headquarters in Tampa, Florida, with an enhanced public posture. What are we to make of it as the nuclear deal looms large? Joining us from Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who is the Project Director in Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and the former Head of Research and Assessment at the IDF's Military Intelligence Directorate. Thank you for joining us, General.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed, also joining us from another location in Central Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish, who is the former Air Defense Chief at the Israel Air Force, as well as a former senior representative of the Israeli Ministry of Defense in Europe. Thank you for joining us as well, General.
Thank you.
And also with me in the studio is always our TV7 editor-at-large and host of TV7 Watchmen Talk and Powers in Play and so much more, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding on specifically Israel's campaign between the wars, or Mabam in Hebrew, what we call in its initials, particularly vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran. To what degree are we in a stage that this campaign between the wars is nearing the latter part of the equation?
So while there is public and, of course, also private disagreement between the government of Israel and the Biden administration regarding the nuclear file and the revival of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, there is no daylight between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli intelligence community in general and the Department of Defense, represented in this region by the Central Command, CENTCOM, which is headquartered at MacDill Air Force Base near Tampa, as you mentioned. But of course, there is always some presence here in the region, be it the Fifth Fleet, which is the naval component of CENTCOM, or the air component. Again, there are expeditionary forces based in Iraq and elsewhere. And the cooperation and collaboration between Israel and the United States against the common adversary, Iran and its proxies, and the idea that a common intelligence picture or air picture, as the case may be, regarding drones and ballistic missiles in order to protect both the friendly Gulf countries as well as Israel, this is taking root, and there are protocols being drafted and exercised. And it also turns out that there are strikes by Israel, mostly by the Israeli Air Force, but some from the ground or even from the sea, and by the CENTCOM forces, as happened in mid-August after several attacks by Iranian militias or proxies against American forces, both in southeastern Syria as well as in the north.
Well, who better to ask about the intelligence assessment than the general in charge, or until late, as of late, of research and assessment at the IDF Military Intelligence Directorate, General Kuperwasser. To what degree do you see the current state in an accelerated pace, considering also everything that is occurring on the diplomatic track in Vienna and elsewhere?
Well, I think, of course, everything is related to everything else, but the campaign between the wars goes on for a long time now, and has in mind the necessity to minimize the capability of the Iranians to strike against Israel if there is going to be a need to take action against the Iranian nuclear facilities, and the Iranians would look for some targets to retaliate for the damage done to them. And in this respect, I think the Americans share the same point of view that we have, that this is justified and has to be done. And the place where it should be done is Syria, where the rules of the game are that Israel enjoys a very wide freedom to maneuver, and not everything it does, or not everything that everybody thinks it does, means that somebody is going to retaliate. Unlike what's happening in Lebanon, where the rules are quite different. In this way, we managed to slow down the pace with which Hezbollah gets advanced weaponry from Iran, and we slow down also the entrenchment of Iran forces in Syria itself, especially in the south. That said, it doesn't mean that we really stop it totally. There is progress done both on the precisely guided munition that the Hezbollah is trying to get from Iran, and in the entrenchment of Iranian forces in Syria. What is important in this respect of cooperation between Israel and the United States is that the Americans, once they are attacked, they retaliate. Americans, unlike Israel, don't wait for just to see a convoy of some arms shipped from Iran to Lebanon to take action. They act only when they are shorted. And that's what we've seen in mid-August, was that there were several occasions in which the Americans were targeted by Iranian proxies, and they responded against the targets that belong to these proxies and to the Iranians that trained them. This is a totally different approach than the Israeli one, and the Israelis are much more determined to take action.
Indeed.
The other thing that happened recently is that because Russia has become so close to the Iranians taking their UAVs in order to fight in Ukraine and sharing their view on the nuclear talks, the threat coming from Russia that may limit our freedom to maneuver operate in Syria was about to rise. Just fortunately, because of the Ukraine war, the Russians had to take out of Syria some of their anti-aircraft batteries, and this compensated for the political developments that could have been just opposite to what Israel needs in Syria. So all in all, I think Israel enjoys relatively wide freedom to maneuver in Syria and to operate in Syria against this effort of the Iranians to build a big capability, a considerable capability to strike Israel in case of Israeli operation against, or Israeli or an American operation against Iranian targets related to the nuclear facilities. And that's where we stand right now.
General Gavish, I'd like to hear your take on this matter, considering also, of course, from the perspective as Israel's or the Israeli military's former air defense chief. Do you see the particularly all the missiles that are spoken of Hezbollah and their arsenals? We're talking about tens of thousands, if not more than 140,000, as well as other surface-to-surface capabilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies. Is this truly a deterrent to Israel's defensive capabilities and that of the United States? Do those impede on the ability to act in a certain way that would then be more deliberate vis-a-vis Tehran's malign behavior throughout the region?
I don't think that deterrence is the right term. Probably those are some considerations that we have to take while operating in the Middle East. But I would like to mention before, because you were talking about the war between wars. And this is quite recent terms. And what exactly is it? I'm not sure that everyone is fully aware of what does it mean, the war between the wars. So war between the wars, I would say, have main two targets. One of them is to have the precise state of mind of within Israel and out of Israel, to understand that even in between the war, the period that we are in, we are fighting. And previous to it, we used to call it, we had wartime and we had peacetime. But unfortunately, in our area, in peacetime, during peacetime, there is a lot of fighting that is going on. So this term was invented in order to be much more precise, looking into the strategic environment. The second thing is that within this period of time, you still prepare yourself to the next war, not to the previous one, which is also very important from a military point of view, not to prepare yourself to the past wars, to prepare yourself to the next wars. Going back to your question, there is no doubt that one of the main challenges is our enemies bringing into the arena more and more rockets and missiles, but not only that, UAVs, we are seeing more of that. If I'm talking about the threats that we are looking at them as for Israeli Air Force air defense, because there are also other threats like cyber threats, like EW threats, like threats which are against our Navy, the precise weapons that have been used already, but looking into the future, it could be even much more complicated. So yes, there is a lot of missiles which are coming into the arena, but also air defense systems. Some of them are equipped by the Russians. They are there in Syria. So from our point of view, we look at it as something that we should consider while we're still doing what we need to do in order to keep what we've been calling the red lines of Israel. So this is something that it doesn't deter us, but for sure something that we need to consider on the offense and also in the defense. As
Jonathan,
you know, in the last years, we developed capabilities in this area of active defense. And the multi-tier concept, which was built here in Israel, this is exactly what we are doing on the defense and others.
Indeed. Mr. Owen?
There is one point which is very important to emphasize, especially to viewers abroad, outside of Israel. For the last 4 years, Israel has been characterized by political instability. These continuous rounds of elections and new governments, new prime ministers and the like. However, on this particular point that we are talking about, there is continuity. And it is not part of the political debate or political controversy. And one reason is that it so happens, and it is very rare in Western democracies of late, that the key officers, when all of this started, the campaign between the wars, former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz and former Air Force Chief Amir are now occupying the top 2 positions in the Ministry of Defense as Minister and Director General. And obviously, they are backing up what their successors in the military have been doing. It all started in January of 2013. We are fast approaching the 10th anniversary of the first strike under Gantz and Eshel in Syria. So Israel, while now being plagued by many problems, is blessed, at least on this particular point, by continuity.
General Kuperwasser, I'd like to hear from your perspective. Mr. Oren spoke about the 10-year period, of course. There have been multiple strikes, particularly against the Iranian proxies, but also against Iranian elements proper. And only a handful of cases where the Iranians actually responded overtly to those strikes, trying to, of course, also failing, but trying to target Israel. Do you see this as a success story on Israel's part, or is there some strategy in mind from Iran's perspective that it is still pursuing, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense from an operational level?
First of all, I think both sides should be praised for their perseverance and insistence on promoting their goals. Both the Israelis who keep punching on the Iranians, and the Iranians who keep shipping their people and weapons to Syria and to Lebanon through Syria. And both sides it tells you how committed they are to getting the goals in this confrontation. The Iranians understand that it's not easy for them to retaliate from Syria. That's why we keep punching them to make sure that this is going to be the case. And once they try, they fail. So it's not a good idea to keep trying. And the way they cope with the situation is that they bring more weapons, they bring more capabilities into Syria, and not responding, because their point is not to win the war between the wars. Their point is to win the war, and the war that will be in the end. They accumulate, as was mentioned here, they accumulate a huge amount of rockets, some of them precisely guided, in the hands of Hezbollah. They believe that this is their safety net, and their deterrence vis-a-vis Israel, or part of their deterrence vis-a-vis Israel, in the case of trying to convince Israel not to carry out an attack against the Iranian nuclear facilities. And that is the most important thing from their point of view, not hitting Israel here and there, which they try occasionally, but not the main issue. And from an Israeli point of view, it is a success. It is a success because if we didn't do all of what we have done, the situation would have been much, 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 much worse. And the number of precisely guided rockets and missiles in the hands of Hezbollah would have been 10 times, at least 10 times more than what they have today. So from this point of view, this is very important, because at the end of the day, if the Iranians are not going to be successful in equipping Hezbollah with a considerable amount of precisely guided rockets, it's going to be, Hezbollah is going to be less inclined to participate fully in confrontation, in a war against Israel.
Indeed.
The fact is that they did get enough in order to threaten, but we see that they have all kinds of considerations, and this is one of them. How much capabilities do we actually have? Are we well equipped for a couple of days of fighting, or are we well equipped for a long fight? And that's something that we want to keep them aware of the limitations. And that's the success of this 10 years of ongoing war campaign between the wars.
Among those, of course, to be praised for Iran's failure to penetrate Israel is General Gavish. And I'd like to ask your perspective on this angle to also expand on it with regard to the cooperation that we're hearing about with our newly acquired partners in the region, also those that we may not have necessarily political relations with. To what degree are the Americans driving this, not only by vocal statements, but by concrete actions as well?
Well, that's a good question, and it's also, if I would take some of the previous question of yours, I would like to say that, when first, the arena is completely different from the past. I mean, if we look on the last 10 to 15 years, last time that we have a real war in the north was in 2006. So if we compare what happened in the last 10 to 15 years, this is a completely different environment that we are in. Today, the Russians are in Syria, the Iranians, as we just talked, are strongly there. Even the Turks are involved in Syria. Hezbollah became in the last 10 to 15 years to one of the largest military forces. I mean, even if you compare the Hezbollah to states in Europe, Hezbollah has a much greater capabilities, military capabilities that a lot of, if compared to a lot of countries within Europe. So it's a completely different environment that we are in, very complex one, from a military point of view and also from a strategic point of view. And going back to your question, I think that one thing that is significant, and we need to talk about it, is the shipment between Israel being under EUCOM and CENTCOM. This is something that was decided 2 years ago, and this is something that is happening during those days. And this is a completely different story, because CENTCOM, this is the US command that is fighting in this area of the Middle East for long years, very experienced in fighting in the Middle East, knows the area, knows the players in this area. And so shifting now, working with CENTCOM, this is something that for sure could and will enhance our capabilities, in the West capabilities, I would say, but of course from Israel, our capabilities for cooperation in this region. And as you said, not only with the United States, also with some other countries. Our ability to be together with the CENTCOM in this area allows us to speak with the other players in the Middle East. So this is something that is happening, and for sure this is something that would enhance the Israeli capabilities if the time would come.
Indeed. Well, intelligence sharing obviously was already quite robust with some of the players here in the region. Nevertheless, this shift from the European command to the Central Command here in the Middle East and North Africa, it does provide a certain element, Mr. Oren, to the ability of Israel to communicate with partners, or not necessarily officially so, since even Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are under the umbrella of CENTCOM. Nonetheless, there are here some iotas.
Well, one should not get too much carried away because the real cooperation is between the Israel Defense Forces, including, of course, the Navy and the Air Force, and the American forces and headquarters here. And through the Americans, most of the information is relayed to the other partners in the Gulf. The Israeli Gulf or Israeli-Arab cooperation, while existing and while striving to get better, is much more limited. And when you have exercises or even operations, it is mostly Americans and Israelis on one hand, and Americans and other on the other hand. You don't have one ship company made up of Americans, Israelis, Saudis, Emiratis, and the like. Not yet. However, for CENTCOM, the special relationship with the Israeli Defense Forces equals what we have come to know regarding the special relationship between the United States, Australia, Canada, and Great Britain. The public is not aware of it, but the excellent camaraderie and confidence between the two militaries, as General Gavish, for instance, can testify to having been in constant touch with his American opposite numbers, is excellent.
Indeed. We're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you a brief opportunity to assess what's about to happen in the near future. We'll start with you, Mr. Oren, since I'd like to also hear your angle to the aspect of, even though our regional partners have aligned interests with the State of Israel vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran, operationally speaking, we do not see the same resolve. Is this something that you expect to see in the near future as well?
It all depends on the JCPOA, on the deal with Iran. Because if Iran gets sanction relief, if Iran gets back into the game financially and as a strategic power, then the Gulf countries will renew and improve their relations with Iran, including at Israel's expense.
Indeed. Of course, we just heard also the former CENTCOM commander, General Kenneth Frank McKenzie, speak about the fact that the JCPOA, or the reinvigoration of this JCPOA, will bring significant more capacity to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which would ultimately impact the malign behavior of the Islamic Republic in our region. General Kuperwasser, to what degree is Israel preparing itself to contend with that?
To a large degree, but is this degree enough? I'm not sure. But, definitely the Middle East is on the verge of major changes, major strategic changes. Whether we conclude, we end up with the conclusion of a new JCPOA or not, this is anyhow going to be a new situation. Totally new situation. With the JCPOA, the Iranians are going to be much more active. Without the JCPOA, the danger of the Iranians trying to rush to a bomb are going to be significant. So anyhow, we are going to be in a situation where we have to be on very high alert to both options, because if the JCPOA succeeds, the proxies are going to get stronger, feel emboldened with the money that the Iranians are going to send them. Anyhow, it's going to be challenging, and this is not the only thing that's happening. There's upheaval in so many places in the Middle East. Look at what's happening in Iraq. Look at what's happening in Iran, in Lebanon. Look at what's happening in Yemen, in Syria. All these areas are going through major changes. Israel has to be on alert, very well prepared to any eventuality. Even when we speak about the feeling that some of these groups have that because the United States is weak, Israel is weaker, they may turn that into efforts to challenge Israel. We see it with Nasrallah and his references to what happens if Israel operates the Karish gas field. And all of that tells us that we have to be on the tip of our toes at this point of time. It's not easy because we are in a continuously political crisis. It's not easy.
Indeed.
Fortunately, we are united on this issue, as Amir said, I think, right, not only on the campaign between the wars, but also on confronting the external threats. We are pretty much united.
General Gavish, shortly, about 30 seconds.
Well, I think that, from Israel, what we should do is really to enlarge our toolbox as much as we can. The area around us is going to be even more challenging than it is today, and keep ourselves under our military strategies that are talking about our attack capability, our alert capabilities, our defense capabilities, and our deterrence capabilities. I think those strategies are still relevant into the future, and we have to be strong on all the different pillars.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank General Kuperwasser, General Gavish, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.